me see my...
Would you rather see the Dark Lord have it, or Saruman of many colors?
Nathan? Christopher Lee's Saruman?
Oh. Your note was not very specific.
Ay.
Welcome back to Faith on Film, where we raid your church library in search of the good stuff. And welcome to another Dabble in the Dark. My name is Nathan.
I'm Stephanie. In the 1970s, a screenwriter named Anthony Schaffer wanted to make a horror film, but he wasn't interested in following the tropes of the Hammer films, which were predominating the genre at that time. Meanwhile, veteran actor Christopher Lee had grown past his typecasting as Dracula and really wanted to spread out his wings as an actor. And it just so happened that Lee had bought the rights to David Pinner's novel Ritual in 1971. So, The Wicker Man was really the perfect match for all of them.
According to legend, Lee was so passionate about making this film that he agreed to do it for no pay. Which, if true, wound up being for the movie's benefit because it doesn't look like they had much of a budget in the first place. But of course, budget does not always correlate with quality. And this film has been lauded as the Citizen Kane of horror, according to Cinefantastique.
You know, this is also the start of an informal trilogy of movies we're going to review that were remade starring Nicolas Cage, along with Wings of Desire and Left Behind. 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
One point of comparison that this has with Citizen Kane is that the twist ending is so famous it's one of the most well-known things about the movie. Heck, this ending is so infamous that it's often the cover on the box or mini posters. It's nearly impossible to not know this, but just in case you're somehow coming into this fresh, consider this your spoiler warning because we're just gonna barrel through a plot synopsis real quick.
Neil Howie, played by Edward Woodward, is a police sergeant who flies to a private island called Summer Isle to respond to an anonymous tip about a missing girl named Rowan Morrison. He quickly discovers that the inhabitants of this island practice Neo-Paganism rather gleefully, and this doesn't sit very well with him as he is a devout Christian man.
Howie is given cryptic answers regarding Morrison's whereabouts or existence in the first place, which frustrates him. He eventually meets with Lord Summerisle, played by the always impressive Christopher Lee, who is the grandson of the man who reintroduced paganism and is currently the religious leader. He eventually puts together clues that the apple harvest last year failed miserably, and Rowan is slated to be sacrificed to produce a more bountiful one this year on May Day. When he does find Rowan, he realizes she was willing bait to draw in the real human sacrifice, him.
Oops.
Yeah, so the inhabitants capture him, put him in a giant human effigy, light it on fire, and thus the movie ends.
You know, I have a feeling that Howie never made detective. I mean, seriously, he can't figure out that he's being led on by the end?
Human sacrifice is a complex topic. Not morally, but historically. There is evidence to suggest it being done throughout human civilization in various parts of the world. But most records of it are viewed with suspicion because they tend to be written by cultures trying to actively make the other culture look bad. And while there is some evidence to suggest it was done in this area, through my admittedly not very detailed research, I was able to determine it seemed to be rare and almost always done to either a condemned criminal or a prisoner of war.
Regardless, it's pretty easy to say that the people of Summer Isle are the villains of this story. Just watch this final scene of the movie. As Howie is screaming in terror, they are singing this happy folk tune gleefully. That is the true terror of this movie. their religion has driven them to do this terrible thing with no feelings of remorse whatsoever.
Well, there's a bit more to it than that. Again, it's hard to put ourselves in this mindset because the ending is so well known. But really think about it. Other than the titular Wicker Man ceremony, what do they do that's so wrong? They promote sex education. They promote living in harmony with each other and with nature, and they pretty well mind their own business. Steph, I need you to be a straw man for me for a moment.
Okay. But they do all sorts of weird stuff, like put frogs in little girls' mouths and wearing weird costumes and throwing alcohol into the sea.
True, but what is it that we see Howie doing to indicate that he's a Christian?
The Eucharist.
Correct, and what is the Eucharist?
That's when we eat the bread and drink the wine to ritually consume the body and blood of Jesus.
Thank you, Stephanie. There's not all that much difference from an outside perspective between Christian rituals and pagan rituals. They seem weird or normal to us based on our familiarity with them. With that in mind, Howie's kind of a blowhard when it comes to religious topics.
Now that you mention it, Howie does kind of take Christianity for granted. He kind of reminds me of that kid who grew up in the church bubble, only interacting with other church people who speak perfect Christianese, only to be completely caught off guard when he ventures into the real world and learns that not everybody was raised with the same knowledge and values that he was.
He spends most of the second act getting increasingly indignant that the people of Summer Isle are not following Christian teachings. When he meets with Lord Summer Isle, he rants about ruined churches, no ministers, no priests, and he even gets mad at girls dancing naked together in the woods.
But they are naked.
Naturally, it's much too dangerous to jump through the fire with your clothes on.
Kinda like the Crucible, now that I think about it.
Later.
He forms a makeshift cross, seemingly just to make himself feel better that there is something here that is Christian. He doesn't even take it with him, he just leaves it there, lying on a tombstone, doing nobody any good.
He also tends to talk down to people as though they're willfully disobeying Christian dogma, rather than considering the even more likely possibility that they're just not that familiar with it. He is told at one point that the school children learn about Christianity in comparison to other religions, but that's not really good enough for him. You know, this leads me to an interesting thought experiment. Would the plot of this story play out about the same if Howie were, say, an anti-theist? Because when you get right down to it, he would be just as insistent that their rituals have no impact on nature whatsoever, and it is very likely that he could be just as bullheaded. This doesn't have to be a dialogue between two different religions. Expecting other people to see the world the way you do, regardless of whether they're hurting anyone, is something we can all fall into. Maybe that's the real horror of this story. In a different context, could Howie be just as gleeful about the ritualistic death of an outsider?
Just to be clear, this doesn't mean that he had it coming. He had it coming. He only had himself to blame. Howie is still the victim, and the Islanders are still the villains. It's even possible that Christopher Lee doesn't buy into the paganism because he exposits about how his grandfather reintroduced it for pragmatic purposes, to give the people a reason to keep the land fertile. Which would make him even more of a monster, killing a man for a thing he doesn't even believe in. But Howie is nonetheless still the one interested in finding the missing girl, which is great. Good for you. But you don't have to be a Christian to be concerned about finding a missing person, contrary to what Pure Flix or Jack Chick publications will tell you.
That does raise a question. What is he ultimately more concerned about? I completely understand his frustration with all the backwards answers and the not so straightforward, the riddles that they keep giving him. But he does seem to get off topic a lot, doesn't he? He'll start out asking an islander about Rowan, and then the next thing you know, they're arguing about the lack of churches or shame about sex, or you get the idea. It's as though they keep baiting him to go off topic, and he falls for it every time.
His religion is pretty important to the plot because it's what motivates him to be a virgin, which is useful for their purposes. They put his resolution to the test by sending Willow, played by Britt Ekland, to tap on his wall, sing a sexy song, and attempt to seduce him. He doesn't go over to her and explains the next morning that he doesn't believe in it before marriage, and that he's engaged.
Hang on a minute. He had a fiancée this entire time, and this is the only time she's mentioned at all. And she's not even really connected to the plot in any way because she's off on the Scottish mainland this whole time. So, what does this piece of information really add? What does this character actually add? I can't help but feel like if you want to make a point about fundamentalism, Howie being chaste for the sake of being chaste would have driven that point home a little bit better. Not to mention, Lord Summerisle, when they're about to sacrifice Howie, explicitly says that no one is going to come looking for him. And that's another one of the reasons why he's the perfect fit for their purposes. I would like to point out that a bride-to-be is very likely going to wonder where the heck her groom disappeared to, and is very likely not going to drop it.
While you're criticizing, I would like to compliment the movie. As said earlier, they had a fairly shoestring budget, and you can tell because most of the stuff in this looks pretty easy to do on the cheap. But there is some fantastic camera work.
That is an advantage for movies that are primarily shot outdoors. Nature on its own is inherently lovely, so you don't really need a lot of special effects to make it look good. All you really need is a cinematographer with a good eye for detail and a dedicated location scout. Although, this story takes place in late April, early May, but this movie was shot in late October, early November.
Isn't the beginning of summer great, Stephanie?
Yeah, real magical.
For that matter, all the actors turned in pretty great performances. Not just Woodward, Lee, and Ekland, but pretty much everybody. Even, there is this one scene where I thought, Willow and her father don't sound very natural, they sound kind of rehearsed, and then I said, oh, they are rehearsed in universe because they're saying these things purely to manipulate Howie.
The music is also pretty well integrated. It's almost entirely diegetic, as in, these are just a lot of folk songs that Howie encounters as he gets to know the island better.
Some of them, such as Summer Is A-Coming In or Corn Rigs, are actually pre-existent songs going back centuries, giving this a feeling of legitimacy.
Although, I have to call into question Willow's song. In universe, there is a man playing the guitar downstairs, but I'm questioning whether the acoustics in that little inn actually carry that guitar all the way upstairs, between the walls and the floor. I'm betting that in universe this song isn't quite as seductive.
This scene is one that differs depending on which cut of the film you watch. In the theatrical cut, which was pared down to be double billed with another movie, Willow's attempted seduction takes place on Howie's first night on the island. In the director's and final cut, however, Howie witnesses Lord Summerisle show up with a young man, sending him up to Willow's room seemingly to have his first sexual experience, accompanied by yet another song. Willow's song, instead, takes place the night of April 30th, which makes a little more sense in the context of the story because it is as Howie has had more time to lose his grip as the frustrating investigation wears on him. Not that I really minded its placement in the theatrical cut, but this is a case of good and better. The final cut generally follows the structure and pacing of the theatrical cut, but with a few scenes spliced in that complement what was already there. The director's cut includes all of these scenes and quite a few more, including the opportunity to see Howie doing police work on the mainland before he gets his assignment. It's generally the consensus that the final cut is the best of the three, since it offers the most without sacrificing pacing, whereas the director's cut, while neat, kind of meanders at times.
I guess it's time to answer the question, is this the Citizen Kane of horror movies? Well, drat. I'm not really a horror movie fan, so I don't really know enough about the competition to make an assessment on that. I will say, however, that as a non-horror movie fan, I was genuinely surprised by how much I got into this movie. I realize that it is more intellectual than some of your typical horror fare, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate to a non-genre fan. Overall, this movie was well made and well acted. The mystery surrounding Rowan Morrison's disappearance was interesting, and of course the payoff was terrific. I'm going to give this one a money's worth. I think I just wish that the ending wasn't so famous.
I don't disagree with anything you said. It is kind of a weird movie to classify. I absolutely get why people label it as horror, but I also get why people laugh at the idea of calling it such. It's not the usual kind of horror that slasher films or supernatural encounter movies have trained us to expect. It's kind of a horror film in the way that It's a Wonderful Life is a Christmas film. Like, the thing that defines it in that genre doesn't show up until the third act, but it has such an impact that it colors the rest of the film in hindsight. Thank you for joining us for Faith on Film. I'm Nathan.
I'm Stephanie. We'll see you next time.
He had it coming. He had it coming. He took a flower in its prime, and then he used it. And he abused it. It was a murder, but not a crime. Lipshits Cicero.